May 12, 1943. Tunisia, North Africa. The heat is a physical weight, pressing down on the cracked earth of the Cap Bon Peninsula. It is a dry, suffocating heat, smelling of cordite, unwashed bodies, and the distinct, metallic tang of radiator fluid leaking from abandoned vehicles. 150,000 men stand in the dust. They are the remnants of the Afrika Korps, the vaunted desert wolves who once threatened to sever the jugular of the British Empire at Suez. But now, the wolves are gaunt. Their uniforms, bleached by the merciless sun, hang loosely on skeletal frames. They surrender not with a roar, but with a collective, exhausted sigh. As the American GIs move in, chewing gum, passing cigarettes, looking strangely well-fed, the German soldiers expect the end. They expect the treatment they themselves meted out on the Eastern Front. They expect a bullet in the back of the neck, or a march into a starvation camp. They do not know it yet, but they are about to embark on a journey that will shatter their worldview more effectively than any artillery barrage. They are about to discover that they have been fighting a war against a ghost, a myth of weakness created by Goebbels. They are about to enter the belly of the beast and find that the beast is not only well-armed, but it is drowning in abundance. The war had been framed for them as a crusade of the vibrant, martial spirit of Germany against the decaying, mongrelized materialism of the West. The United States, the propaganda machine insisted, was a hollow shell. It was a nation of gangsters and cowboys, racially impure, culturally bankrupt, and militarily incompetent. A German soldier was worth 10 Americans. The American factories were striking, the people were starving, and the Jewish cabal controlling the White House had no stomach for a real fight. This was the truth drilled into the minds of the men standing in the Tunisian dust. It was the armor they wore over their souls. But as they were herded onto the Liberty ships, vessels built in mere weeks by a workforce that supposedly didn't want to work, that armor began to show its first hairline cracks. The transition from the desert to the hold of the ship was the first shock. These men, many of whom had subsisted on hardtack and dirty water for months, were terrified of the Atlantic crossing. They knew the efficiency of their own U-boats. They knew the wolf packs were hunting. There was a grim irony in the fear. They were afraid of being killed by their own countrymen. But as the convoy assembled, stretching from horizon to horizon, the scale of the Allied logistics operation began to dawn on them. There were destroyers everywhere. There were corvettes, frigates, and the endless line of transport ships. The ocean, which Hitler had promised to dominate, seemed to belong entirely to the enemy. Down in the holds, the air was thick, but it was not the air of a death camp. It was the air of transit. And then came the first meal. It was not a banquet, but to a man who had been scraping the bottom of a tin for crumbs, it was a revelation. Canned meat, fruit, coffee that smelled like actual coffee, not the roasted acorn substitute, Ersatz-Kaffee, that had plagued Europe since 1940. But the true shock, the object that would become the recurring totem of their confusion, was the bread. In the German Wehrmacht, bread was life, but it was dark, heavy, sour rye, Kommissbrot. It was dense, made to last, often extended with sawdust or potato flour as the blockade tightened. On the American transport ship, the bread was white, pure, blindingly white, soft as a cloud. To the German soldier, white bread was a delicacy reserved for the aristocracy, for Sunday mornings in peacetime, or for the sick. Here, it was stacked in trays, tossed casually onto mess tins. A soldier from Hamburg, holding a slice of this cake, as he called it, wept. He wept not just from hunger, but from a sudden, terrifying realization. If the enemy could feed its prisoners, the lowest of the low, with the food of kings, what were they feeding their soldiers? What kind of nation had so much wheat, so much milling capacity, so much fuel for ovens, that it could waste white flour on the enemy? The white bread was the first bullet in the heart of National Socialism. The voyage took weeks, a zigzagging course through the gray Atlantic. When the coastline of the United States finally broke the horizon, it wasn't the jagged, fortified cliffs of Fortress Europe. It was something else. Depending on where they docked, Boston, Norfolk, or New York, the reaction was universally one of silence. A stunned, heavy silence. For 3 years, Europe had lived in the dark. The blackout was the law. A single lit cigarette could invite a grand slam bomb. Cities were tombs at night, navigated by touch and memory. As the prisoner transport ships glided into New York Harbor, the German POWs crowded the railings. It was night, and the city was ablaze. They saw the skyline of Manhattan not as a silhouette against the moon, but as a glittering mountain of electric light. Broadway, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, millions of bulbs burning with a reckless, arrogant disregard for energy conservation. There were no sirens, no searchlights scanning for bombers. Just light, an ocean of light. A lieutenant from the Africa Corps, writing in his diary later that night, noted, "We were told America was in chaos. We were told their cities were crumbling. But I see the lights of 1,000 years. I see a civilization that does not even know it is at war." The psychological impact of the unbombed city was devastating. In Hamburg, in Berlin, in Cologne, the rubble was already piling up. The Royal Air Force by night and the U.S. Army Air Force by day were systematically dismantling the German urban landscape. Here, the glass was intact. The paint was fresh. The cars moving along the West Side Highway had their headlights on. It was a display of invulnerability that no speech by Goebbels could counter. The American homeland was a sanctuary, a titan sleeping in a bed of electricity, seemingly untouched by the fires consuming the rest of the world. After the processing, delousing, identification, the stripping of weapons but the retention of metals, the journey into the interior began. This was the phase where the sheer scale of the American continent began to crush the German strategic mind. Germany is roughly the size of Montana. To a soldier raised in the dense, compartmentalized geography of Europe, the concept of distance in America was alien. They were loaded onto trains, often Pullman passenger cars that were cleaner and more comfortable than the first-class carriages of the Reichsbahn. They traveled for days. They looked out the windows and saw cornfields that stretched beyond the curvature of the earth. They saw wheat fields in Kansas that looked like gold oceans. They saw herds of cattle in Texas that numbered in the tens of thousands. And they saw the trains, endlessly moving. Eastbound trains loaded with tanks, jeeps, crates of ammunition, and airplane fuselages. Westbound trains loaded with raw iron, ore, coal, and timber. The tracks were heavy with traffic. In Germany, the rail lines were being severed daily by Thunderbolts and Mustangs. Here, the circulatory system of the industrial giant was pumping at high pressure, unobstructed. One prisoner, a mechanic from the Ruhr Valley, watched a freight train pass their siding. He counted the flat cars. 50 Sherman tanks, he whispered to his comrade. "I just counted 50 tanks on one train. We didn't see 50 tanks in the entire last month in Tunisia." His comrade said nothing, just chewed slowly on the white bread sandwich provided for lunch. The math didn't work. The German high command had spoken of quality over quantity, of the superiority of the Tiger tank over the Ronson lighter Sherman. But the mechanic knew the truth of mechanics. Quantity has a quality all its own. If you have one Tiger and they have 50 Shermans, the Tiger dies. The train rolled on, carrying them deeper into the heart of the enemy's strength. They arrived at the camps. Camp Aliceville in Alabama, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Concordia in Kansas. There were over 700 camps scattered across the United States, housing nearly 400,000 German prisoners by the end of the war. The men expected dungeons. They expected barbed wire enclosures in mud pits. What they found were small towns. The barracks were wooden, raised off the ground, heated by stoves. There were showers with hot water. Actual hot water, available every day. There were recreational halls. There were soccer fields. And there was the mess hall. The mess hall was the battlefield where the Nazi ideology suffered its greatest defeat. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war must be fed the same rations as the captors' rear echelon troops. In the U.S. Army, that ration was set at roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. For a German soldier who had been surviving on 1,500 calories of poor-quality starch, the American tray was a grotesque miracle. Steak, potatoes swimming in butter, eggs, bacon, milk, fresh milk, not powdered, vegetables, and again, the bread. Piles of it. At Camp Robinson in Arkansas, a riot almost broke out on the first day, not because of mistreatment, but because the prisoners thought they were being mocked. When the dinner was served, pork chops and mashed potatoes, the senior German officer demanded to see the camp commander. He slammed his fist on the table. "Do not play games with us," he shouted. "This is a propaganda trick. You feed us like this today, and tomorrow you starve us. We are soldiers, not fools." The American commander, bewildered, simply shook his head. "This is Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday is pork chops. Wednesday is chicken." It wasn't a trick. It was the standard operating procedure of a nation that produced so much food it didn't know how to ration it effectively. The waste alone stunned the Germans. They watched American guards toss half-eaten apples into the trash. They saw loaves of bread discarded because they were slightly stale. To a European, accustomed to hoarding every crust, this was sinful. It was a level of abundance that bordered on obscenity. But it forced a question into their minds. If America can waste this much, what does it have in reserve? The transformation was slow, but inevitable. The die-hard Nazis in the camps, the Lazarus Justicine, tried to maintain discipline. They held kangaroo courts at night, beating up fellow prisoners who showed too much friendliness to the Americans. They sang the Horst Wessel song and insisted that the Führer had a secret weapon that would turn the tide. But the reality of the day-to-day existence eroded their authority. It is hard to preach the impending collapse of the American plutocracy when you are gaining weight in their prison camps. The U.S. government began a re-education program. But the most effective re-education was the labor program. With millions of American men overseas, the U.S. faced a labor shortage. The Geneva Convention allowed enlisted POWs to work for pay. Officers were exempt. Tens of thousands of Germans volunteered. They were sent to harvest cotton in Mississippi, to pick tomatoes in Indiana, to work in canneries in Wisconsin. Here, the master race came face to face with the mongrel nation. A German corporal, working a combine harvester on a Kansas farm, found himself working alongside a teenage farm boy and his grandfather. The German expected the Americans to be lazy, disorganized, and stupid. Instead, he found them to be mechanically ingenious. The American farmer didn't march. He tinkered. If a machine broke, he fixed it with a piece of wire and a wrench. He didn't wait for orders from Berlin. This individual initiative, this casual competence, was baffling to men raised on the strict hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, and then there was the equipment. The German army was still largely horse-drawn. In 1944, the Wehrmacht used millions of horses to move supplies. In America, the German POWs saw tractors everywhere. They saw trucks in numbers that defied comprehension. They saw a mechanized agriculture that produced the mountains of food they were eating. One POW wrote home, letters that were censored but often allowed through if they weren't explicitly political, saying, "Mother, the war is lost. I am working on a farm that has more gasoline in its shed than our entire division had in Tunisia. They use gasoline to wash their hands." The symbolism of the white bread continued to haunt them. It became the currency of their realization. In the camp canteens, they could buy beer, cigarettes, and chocolate with the scrip they earned from their labor. They could buy toiletries. They were living better than the civilians in Berlin. The cognitive dissonance was painful. How could a degenerate democracy provide a standard of living that the glorious Third Reich could not even dream of? A pivotal moment for many occurred in 1944 and 1945, as new prisoners arrived from the Normandy campaign and the Battle of the Bulge. The old prisoners, the Afrika Korps men, looked at the new arrivals with pity. The new men were boys and old men, ragged, terrified, speaking of firestorms in Dresden and the relentless, crushing advance of the Patton's Third Army. The old prisoners showed the new ones the mess hall. They showed them the white bread. "Eat," they said. "The Americans are trying to kill us with calories." It was a dark joke, but it carried a heavy truth. The ideological fanaticism of the new arrivals often crumbled within weeks. It is difficult to maintain a belief in your own racial superiority when your captors are taller, healthier, better equipped, and treating you with a detached, professional indifference. The Americans didn't hate the Germans with the visceral fury the Germans expected. There was anger, certainly, especially as news of the concentration camps began to leak out in 1945. But for the most part, the Americans treated the POWs as a logistical problem to be solved or as useful labor. This lack of emotional engagement was perhaps the most insulting thing of all. To the American industrial machine, the German soldier wasn't a warrior of legend. He was just another unit to be processed, fed, and put to work. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the men in the camps knew it was coming. They had watched the newsreels in the camp theaters. They had seen the footage of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, an armada of steel that covered the ocean. They had seen the B-29s. They knew, when the time came for repatriation, starting in 1946, the mood was complex. Many did not want to leave. They had spent 2 or 3 years in the Golden Cage, protected from the horrors of the Eastern Front, fed on milk and honey. They were healthy. They had learned English. Some had even fallen in love with local American girls, shouting across the fences or passing notes during harvest detail. They were loaded back onto the ships. The reverse journey was somber. They were leaving the land of light and returning to the continent of ruins. As the ships pulled away from New York, they saw the skyline again. It was still lit. It had never dimmed. They arrived in Le Havre or Rotterdam or Hamburg, and they stepped into a nightmare. Germany was a moonscape of craters and twisted rebar. The smell of death hung over the cities. The people, their families, were skeletal, living in cellars, scavenging for coal. The returning POWs were distinct. They were physically larger than the men who had stayed. Their skin was clear. They had muscle on their bones. They carried duffel bags filled with saved luxuries, coffee, nylon stockings for their wives, and yes, often a loaf or two of white bread, wrapped carefully, already going stale. But an artifact of a different world, they were greeted with suspicion by some, with envy by others. But they carried with them a secret knowledge that would shape the future of post-war Germany. They knew, with absolute certainty, that the totalitarian way was a lie. They had seen the alternative. They had seen a democracy that was chaotic, loud, and racially divided, yet capable of generating power and wealth on a scale that shattered the laws of physics as the Nazis understood them. The transition was complete. The young men who had stood in the Tunisian dust, sneering at the American cowboys, were now the men who would rebuild Germany. They would rebuild it not on the Prussian model of blood and iron, but on the American model of production and trade. The economic miracle of the 1950s in West Germany was built, in part, by men who had spent their formative years picking cotton in Mississippi and eating steak in Alabama. In the end, the most powerful weapon the United States deployed in World War II was not the atomic bomb, nor the Sherman tank, nor the P-51 Mustang. It was the logistics of abundance. It was the undeniable, crushing reality of a society that could fight a global war on 2 fronts and still bake white bread for its prisoners. Years later, an old man in Munich would sit at a cafe, cutting a slice of cake. He would look at the white flour, the sugar, the cream. He would remember the taste of the bread in 1943. He would remember the lights of New York. And he would realize that the moment he stepped off that Liberty ship, the war had ended for him. Not because he had surrendered, but because he had seen the future. And the future was not a boot stamping on a human face. It was a factory whistle, a field of wheat, and a loaf of white bread, soft as a cloud, sitting on a metal tray in the middle of Texas.